Amendment Bill 2024 be referred to the Joint Select Committee standing on governance and policy matters. Since then, that committee has been meeting and doing its work and has finally concluded that work. And I have been requested on behalf of the chairman and members of that committee to present the report on the committee's deliberations. And I therefore now present this report to this honorable Senate.
Thank you very much, Senator Nurse. And I would want to, on behalf of the honourable senators, to thank you and Senator Nichols and any other members from this chamber who are on the committee for the work that you did. I can see based on the printed volume that it is a quite sizable volume of work, and we will, I'm sure, have the opportunity to consider it in due course. Thank you very much for the hard work put into the deliberations and the results therefrom.
Resume.
Public business resumed.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Amendment Bill. I'm sorry. Number 3, sir. Bit previous, sir. Apologies. I'll read it again. Order number 3, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Marine Transport Emissions Control Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I wish, before I get into the meat of my presentation, to join you and Senator Boyce, who spoke earlier today, in extending condolences on the passing of our own former Deputy President, the Honourable Cappy Greenidge. I had the privilege of serving in this honourable chamber for the duration of my term so far in the Senate, and it was his leadership as the Deputy President at the time that I think in many instances, at a time where the Senate was perhaps a lot of times very energized by some of the contributions by some of the members, we were always graced by Cappy, as we called him, Cappy's calm, purposeful, always gracious demeanor, and we will very much miss him as we go forward. Mr. President, today I am presenting on the Marine Transport Emissions Control Suite of Laws, and I want to focus our attention. It is a considerable bill. It has been on the order paper for an extended period of time, so I am confident that we have all had an opportunity to review the bill. When we met some time ago, we did discuss the Marine Transport Bill, which carries some of the relevant elements that will be covered here today. Mr. President, I will, in the course of my presentation, speak about the entity that is responsible for anchoring this suite of legislation, what the global rules have been prior to these amendments, and also, Mr. President, what has precipitated them taking root in countries like ours around the world. And then, Mr. President, I want to spend some time in particular, given, of course, that I used to be Minister with responsibility for international transport, and so I do have some knowledge of where this originated, and much of that work would have started even before I was the minister. It would have started when there was a Ministry of Blue Economy and Maritime Affairs under the Honourable Kirk Humphrey. It would have continued under my role as International Transport Minister, and even now it continues under the current Minister with responsibility for international transport. So I will speak about that from that perspective, Mr. President, but I will, of course, also draw some attention to Part 4 of the legislation, which speaks to energy efficiency for ships given my current role as Minister of Energy. So, Mr. President, this legislation and this conversation has been couched very much within the context of climate change, climate resilience, the need for countries and industry to work collaboratively under a global framework to be able to reduce the impact of ships' emissions, carbon emissions, to reduce the impact of carbon and greenhouse gases on our environment, and to ensure that there is a regulatory framework that puts in place the necessary requirements for us to achieve those objectives, the objectives of reducing and mitigating greenhouse gases. Now, Mr. President, I don't think that I need, at this stage, to speak about what climate change is. I don't think that I need, at this stage, to go over why Barbados has put its brand behind the issues of climate change, and why Barbados' Prime Minister herself has become perhaps the leading voice globally on all things climate. Climate change now has become the climate crisis because of countries like ours and voices like Prime Minister Mottley's. And so, Mr. President, the International Maritime Organization, with whom Barbados has had a long-standing, well-established relationship, is the entity that is responsible for evolving what I think all of us who have been working in international transport for any period of time, evolving a considerable body of work around shipping. How shipping, Mr. President, is going to evolve in terms of cleaner fuels, how shipping is going to evolve in terms of regulatory management, disposal of waste. All of those are questions that the International Maritime Organization has been concerning itself, Mr. President. And as you know, recently Barbados would have hosted the Global Supply Chain Conference, and while here, the Director General of the IMO was here on island, and we had the opportunity to meet with him. And one of the things that we discussed in those meetings, Mr. President, was the fact that when he assumed office of the IMO, not only did he begin the process of looking at the work that the IMO was doing and what needed to be done moving forward, but also revamping the work of technical assistance that was being provided by the IMO to be able to allow countries to evolve their regulatory frameworks, their legislative frameworks, and their development infrastructure to be able to address the needs of the shipping industry, specifically as we spoke about issues relating to climate. And the legislation, Mr. President, therefore covers a range of these items. If you were to go through the legislation itself, Mr. President, is divided in parts. The legislation speaks about the prevention of air pollution, for example, in section part 3, from shipping activities. It covers, Mr. President, specifically for large-scale vessels, vessels of 400 gross tons and above, and the equivalent, therefore, is covered in 400 gross tons for vessels. Those will be the ones that are operating in and around Barbados' waters. I'm going to come back to part 4, which is the one I want to spend some time on. It goes on in part 5, Mr. President, to speak about the nomination of surveyors and certifying of certificates, emissions reductions for vessels, the fuel options and fuel compliance, the national level maritime energy governance, and so on. I want to focus attention today on 2 elements of the legislation, Mr. President, as captured in the legislation that we have here. The first one, Mr. President, speaks to, in part 7, fuel options and fuel compliance. Mr. President, I, as Minister of Energy, also happen to be the minister with responsibility for the Barbados National Oil Company. And under the Barbados National Oil Company, Mr. President, the fuels that are imported into the country are done largely under the umbrella of BNOC, call it BNOC. One of the things that we have become very proud of, Mr. President, is that Barbados has been determined by most of the providers across the region, but most specifically in the context of this legislation, by the shipping community to have the highest quality fuel in the region. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that ships, both cruise and cargo, oftentimes opt to have their bunkering services done here in Barbados as opposed to many of the other jurisdictions in the region, largely because the quality of what we call our ultra-low sulfur diesel is spec higher than most other jurisdictions. That, Mr. President, is one of the things of which we are proud. When our teams from BNOC, Mr. President, spend time looking for suppliers of fuel products, one of the things that they're always troubled by, a lot of times, is that Barbados' specs are higher than most of our counterparts in the region. And what that means, Mr. President, is that oftentimes, when the ships come here, not only are they already looking for cleaner fuels, but that they are also understanding that as they transition their own equipment to be in compliance with IMO regulations, that Barbados is that hub. And for a country, Mr. President, that imports 90% of what it consumes through its ports, in particular, 90% of all goods come through the Bridgetown port, Mr. President, therefore on ships. It is important that as we look at our carbon emissions and our carbon footprint, that we integrate our productive sectors, our tradable sectors, in particular, the amount of goods that we import, we've already captured that at around 90%, with a regulatory regime that minimizes our carbon emissions and does not add to the challenges of climate and climate crisis in particular. In addition, Mr. President, you know that there have been these YouTube videos that you have seen or on social media from time to time. You will see these videos of ships offshore disposing of waste in a way that is perhaps not acceptable. Those regulations have already been introduced by the IMO over the last several years, and they are also captured in this legislation, Mr. President. It does speak about waste. In the Bridgetown port, Mr. President, and I believe you know that I was also chairman of the Bridgetown port for some time, the Bridgetown port has the responsibility to receive ships' waste. It has a responsibility to receive waste from the ships, and it has to be disposed of in situ. It cannot be removed from the Bridgetown port under our environmental rules and brought into the country into land-based sources of disposal. And so the port, the Bridgetown port, has in-house capacity to be able to dispose of that waste. But what is more important, Mr. President, is that historically, the port would have received the waste from the ships, but now, Mr. President, more and more ships have on-board incineration capacity, and therefore, more and more waste is being disposed of on board the ship with limited capacity for air pollution by using newer technology, Mr. President, like pyrolysis and those other technologies that have evolved that allow for waste to be converted to energy on board the ships, and then the receiving country, like Barbados, portside, would be receiving only the ash where applicable, and then that is what is disposed, Mr. President. So these things have very practical implementation when you begin to look at what happens portside and what happens on board the ship. So the quality of fuels matter, the disposal of waste on board the ships matter, Mr. President, but also in this legislation in Part 4, it requires ships to do a number of things, including, Mr. President, under the MARPOL Annex 6, it requires ships to look not only at the quality of the fuel that they are receiving, but it requires them to keep bunkering notes, to keep detailed notes which capture that fuel quality and to be in possession of those notes for a period of 3 years so that you can always conduct an audit of what your fuel and your energy efficiency is, Mr. President. Local fuel suppliers are also going to be required to register with the Barbados Maritime Transport Administration and to submit annual declarations of compliance with the IMO set fuel oil requirements on fuel suppliers. And this is part of the requirement for us as a flag state to ensure that we are effectively monitoring and regulating local fuel suppliers as required by MARPOL 6. MARPOL 6. The one element that I want to focus on, as I mentioned here under Part 4, Mr. President, is that this legislation requires now ships to have an energy efficiency regulatory framework. What is that, Mr. President? What does that talk about? The energy efficiency regulatory framework includes a number of elements. One, it requires an energy efficient design index. And what is that? It is a measure that the IMO has imposed on vessels that requires the use of energy-efficient equipment and energy-efficient engines on new builds. When we were in the port, Mr. President, we would have an annual 5-year exercise, in the first instance, in a longer range 10-year exercise, which looked at, for cruise in particular, what the industry was doing, where the industry was going. And usually in that assessment, we could see how many new ships in the cruise industry were on order, when they were set to take delivery, where they were likely to be deployed, and we could project outward what the Bridgetown Port's capacity was likely to be by cruise line based on new ships on order. You saw, Mr. President, very recently, just a few years ago, that Royal Caribbean would have commissioned its first LNG ship, and it was commissioned here in Barbados. And it was bunkered and provided the fuel here in Barbados through the Barbados National Oil Company, Mr. President. That is because Barbados has distinguished itself as a global leader, not just in climate, Mr. President, not just in the cruise and the tourism industry, but also, Mr. President, we have connected that leadership in practical ways to the productive sectors, in this instance, Mr. President, to the shipping industry. So the Energy Efficiency Design Index, Mr. President, is one of those elements which seeks to reduce the amount of pollution coming from new build ships. You also have, Mr. President, under that same framework, the index, it is a requirement, Mr. President, to ensure that it is reducing the greenhouse gases and that there is an actual calculation mechanism that allows for that. There's also, Mr. President, a ship energy efficiency management plan. That is one of the things that is required. All ships of 400 gross tons and above engaged in international voyages are required by the IMO to develop and keep on board a ship energy efficiency management plan in accordance with the IMO guidelines. This is specific to each ship. Mr. President, a cruise ship that has the capacity to carry 5,000 vessels, 5,000 passengers, an Oasis class, an XL class, versus a cargo ship, they're all very different. And so the energy efficiency management plan must be made specific to each ship. And so the ship plan, Mr. President, is a requirement for ship owners and operators to manage operations and to improve their energy efficiency over time. It is an ongoing process, Mr. President, and you can see that there are already significant gains being realized. There's a requirement, Mr. President, also for fuel consumption and data reporting. The IMO now requires ships to collect and report ship fuel oil consumption data. This is going to be accompanied by a statement of compliance issued by the flag administration, whichever flag the country the ship is carrying. And in Barbados' case, if it is a flag state, a ship carrying Barbados' flag, it should then have that compliance certificate issued by the Barbados Maritime Transport Administration. That is going to be executed on by the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. You then have an international energy efficiency certificate. And then, Mr. President, you also have specific elements in this section of the legislation, particularly all the way through in 41 to 43, which outlines the methodology to be used for surveying, verifying, and certifying the regime for ships as being compliant with the standards that we have just outlined, Mr. President. So those are the energy components that I have spoken about in part 4. I have spoken also about the fuel options and fuel compliance requirements also. So you have fuel oil sampling, for example. At BNOT, one of the things that we are now in the process of doing is investing capacity in laboratory infrastructure at BNOT, at a terminal oil company, to be able to undertake testing right here in Barbados for fuel quality. Typically, you are able to get it done here, but only up to a certain level. We want to be able to ensure that as Barbados executes on its ambitions of becoming a logistics hub, more vessels are coming to Barbados, that we have the capacity to test that fuel here on island. That is particularly important, not in the maritime sector so much, but on the aviation side, Mr. President, where aviation fuel must always be tested. So we will be building that capacity here in Barbados. In terms of the governance mechanisms that are being proposed in this legislation, Mr. President, they're all captured with regard underneath the umbrella of the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport. The Ministry of Tourism and International Transport will be responsible for the national level maritime energy governance. They will be responsible for the inspection regime. The Bridgetown Port will have responsibility as the port state control, and together, Mr. President, with all of the relevant agencies that are then meant to take responsibility, you will have the capacity being built for Barbados to be one of those countries that are compliant. Mr. President, also captured here will be a couple of things that we have already covered, and I want to make it simple for people to understand. Driving our cars, Mr. President, when driving our cars, you know, when you see somebody's car backfiring, and all of a sudden the smell of the car, and you see the white rings coming out from a car, this legislation, as it relates to ships, also includes exhaust gas cleaning systems operations requirements. And so at Part 11, it requires ships to meet those requirements where your exhaust is almost non-existent, and that there are prohibitions that are incorporated, in particular in clauses 100 through 106 of the legislation, Mr. President. That is captured here. I want, Mr. President, now to go to Part 12 of the legislation, where it talks about sustainable economic development initiatives. Mr. President, this morning, I was a little late, and I believe I've already apologized to the colleagues for arriving a little late. I was very pleased. I think everyone knows that when I joined the Senate and when I joined the government, I came to the government from the University of the West Indies, where I headed the commercial arm of the University of the West Indies. And I still remain very deeply embedded in the community from where I came. The University of the West Indies educated me both at undergraduate at the Mona level and the graduate level at the Cape Hill campus in partnership with other entities. And so, Mr. President, I remain committed to our regional institutions, and in particular to the University of the West Indies. So this morning I was pleased to join my colleagues at UWI for the launch of the International School for Development Justice. And while I was sitting there, Mr. President, and watching the University of the West Indies launch their first and their latest spin-off company, to be able to go into the space that this particular legislation and so many other things have gone before, implementation mechanism for the Sustainable Development Goals for small island developing states. The University of the West Indies this morning launched an initiative under the International School for Development Justice, which is a partnership with all of the campuses, all 5 campuses of the UWI, to teach a series of master's courses in partnership with the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, the University of Glasgow in the UK, and funded by IDB Invest as the development partner. You can pursue master's degrees jointly issued by these institutions and the United Nations University as well in all of the areas relating to Sustainable Development Goals realization, in all the areas relating to climate justice, in all the areas relating to development of small island developing economies. And as I sat there this morning, I want to commend the University of the West Indies on a well-thought-out initiative, and in particular, Vice-Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, whose brainchild it was. I want to commend the University of the West Indies. As I look, Mr. President, at Part 11 of the legislation, where it spoke about sustainable development initiatives, I want to throw out the challenge to the University of the West Indies. The University of the West Indies has just, in a seminal moment, achieved a phenomenal accomplishment, and I'm incredibly proud of them. But I sit presently in the government of Barbados, in the Ministry of Energy and Business. And in that ministry, we see, and across Barbados, the work and the support of international development agencies supporting countries just like Barbados and in the Pacific and in the African region to achieve their development goals, their sustainable development goals. We have seen the development community all across the globe working with developing nations like ours to address the impact of the climate crisis. Barbados has been at the forefront of that. And I would welcome the University of the West Indies, through the International School for Development Justice, to be sitting in the center of the development conversation, providing policy-driven research on areas of priority interest to countries like ourselves that then can be acted on as part of our development agenda. The University of the West Indies and all of the other functional institutions of the Caribbean civilization, those that have been created by us and for us, like the Caribbean Development Bank, like all of the other entities that are here in the region, they have a central and a critical role to play in the implementation of our sustainable development objectives. They have a critical role to play in the policy advancement of our climate crisis interventions, Mr. President. And I welcome what the University of the West Indies has launched today as yet another opportunity of them putting to practical work, putting into practical service the tremendous intellectual prowess that the University of the West Indies has been garnering. As I close out, Mr. President, on this legislation, I wanted to ensure that I covered one remaining section in the legislation. I wanted, Mr. President, to speak specifically about penalties. I wanted to speak about penalties and the application of penalties in the event of breaches. The legislation includes, in Part 12, a series of sections 18, administrative penalties, notices around administrative penalties, and how those things can be challenged by a shipping company in the event that they are dissatisfied with what has been issued. There are general penalties, and then there are enforcement provisions. I know that one of my colleagues here always talks about enforcement. How are we going to enforce this, Mr. President? And what we have seen is that by the establishment of the Maritime Transport Governance Framework under the Ministry of International Transport, that the expectation is there will be the capacity vested in that agency, and we will see that evolving in time to come. I want, Mr. President, to commend this legislation to the Honourable Chamber. There are a series of schedules appended to the legislation which capture the various draft texts, which allow for you to see what the certificates would look like, what the energy efficiency certificate would look like, what the various certificates, all of them, would look like, Mr. President, so that there is no ambiguity about what is expected and what is going to be implemented, Mr. President. This is the bill before this Honourable Chamber, Mr. President. I know that we have supported in the past all of the elements relating to climate change and climate crisis that have been affecting our country. We have just seen, Mr. President, the passage of Hurricane Beryl. We've just had another hurricane affecting Bermuda, and we are still only in August. We still have all the way through to November to make our way. And therefore, Mr. President, the fact that the climate crisis is here and present with us and creating and presenting clear and present dangers by way of increased climate events is a fact that we must live with. But that it is also present, Mr. President, in areas relating to our maritime space, in particular a nation like Barbados that has 400 times its land space in its maritime space. This is a critical piece of legislation, and I'm hopeful that we can get the support of our honourable members in giving this legislation your nod today. And with these few words, Mr. President, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummings. Senator Malauulu. Senator Cummings, could you move that the bill be read a second time?
Mr. President, I beg to move that the bill be read a second time.
Thank you very much. Senator Maldo.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President. A few comments on this bill. First of all, sir, let me start by saying that I am not a climate change denier. I, like our Prime Minister and the Senator who has just led this on government business, I have seen the clear and present danger. I am one who is well aware of the overwhelming evidence that our human activity on this earth is affecting our climate. I see it in ways that perhaps others don't see it because I manage to travel, and with my work and other things, I see places in this world where they could grow grapes before and make wine, and that's gone. The weather is too warm, it doesn't happen anymore. I see places where people could ski and enjoy recreation because they had snow, and there hasn't been snowfall now in many years. I see places where the rainfall just here in Barbados, I don't know, maybe it's me, it seems to be heavier, more concentrated, and then we see all of the hurricane activity and so on. I think there is overwhelming evidence, sir, for climate change. I think there's overwhelming evidence that our human activities have affected our climate that we live in, and urgent action is needed. So I wanted to start by saying that, because if you only listen perhaps to some other comments I might have, you might think that I am disagreeing with what is in this legislation, but I am not, sir. I want to be practical, though, and I want to perhaps jump in where the Honourable Senator made a reference to Barbados's sea. Our maritime space is 400 times bigger than our land space. Let me give you another reference point. We are 260,000 people, more or less, in Barbados, sir, out of 8.2 billion in this world today. 260,000 out of 8.2 billion. Sir, that is less than 4/100,000ths of the population of the world is in Barbados. That is 0.000031 of the population of the world lives in Barbados. But we bear the brunt of the climate change that has happened with many, many others of these billions of people that don't live here. But sir, when I travel, it's interesting some of the things I see. This year, and I start with this little story before I get to the substantive matters of some of the in the act. This year I had occasion for the first time to travel to Saudi Arabia, to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And I want to share with you what I saw there, sir. Sir, Saudi Arabia is a country that is the second largest producer of oil in the world. The second largest. I always thought they were the first. They produce 12.4 million barrels of oil per day. The United States of America produces more than that per day. That is 4.5 billion barrels of oil they're producing per day. 32 million people live in Saudi Arabia, sir. It's about 128 times the size of Barbados. When I was there, sir, I did not see one photovoltaic panel. Not one. Not on the ground or on the roof. I didn't see one electric vehicle. And you know what else I didn't see, sir? I didn't see one cloud in the sky either. Absolutely crystal clear for the week I was there. But not a PV panel in sight, sir. I say that because it really rocked me when I left there as to what could we possibly be doing with our 260,000 people in Barbados when there are countries like this who are air conditioning open spaces. You heard me correct, sir? Open spaces with air conditioners that are being energized by fossil fuels somewhere else, producing carbon into the atmosphere, and they're spewing cold air into the... Because they can do it. They have, look at my note here, they have reserves of 266 billion gallons of oil. So to burn a little bit of oil to air condition an area is no consequence. But we in little Barbados, sir, We are doing all that we can, and our Prime Minister is leading this charge. And I echo the words of the Honourable Senator, that it is an honourable duty that our Prime Minister is doing in raising the awareness of the impacts of climate change on small island developing states like ourselves. But, sir, we have to think very carefully, I believe, about what is the cost of many of these regulations that we are putting on ourselves. We need to be realistic about what we can afford and what difference it will make. I know we need to lead. But, sir, if I give you an analogy, maybe so that, because when we talk about billions of barrels of oil and so on, I don't understand. I don't even know how much is in a barrel of oil. It's more than a can, I guess. It's a big barrel. But if I have a little water leak at home and my tap is dripping, and let's say it was dripping a little ounce per day, would I spend $100 to fix that tap? Chances are, sir, I wouldn't. You probably wouldn't recommend it. I spent $100 to fix a tap that was just a little drip here and a little drip there. But if I knew that I only ever had one last gallon of water in this world to use, I might spend $100 to do it. And that is the urgency that we face with today, is that we are reaching the point with the temperature increasing that we have to spend everything that we can. But we did not cause this problem. Where are we getting this money from to solve some of this? So that is going to be at the core of my comments today. And what I would like to do is, I want to be clear, I have no opposition to this legislation, but I do have some questions, sir. And here are where these questions will come at. The obligations that this legislation places upon the ships that are plying their trade in our water are flagged, and they're over a certain size, 150 tons, I think is where it's at, are significant obligations that are placed on the ships, and it's significant obligations that are placed on us as a country. So the questions that I have would be, have we checked with the operators of the vessels and the vessel owners, the vessel companies that actually do business in our waters, that they can comply with this regulation? Because this is significant legislation that puts requirements on them. Have we checked with them? Now, I've heard the mention of the cruise ships. Yes, of course, these newer cruise ships that are being built to very high standards, but they're not the only ones who are in our waters. What about the feeder container ships? I believe one is Crawley, or is one of the brands, I believe. I don't want to cause any trouble, but I believe that there are many feeder ships that ply between the islands, carry containers and stuff like that, and they're over 150 tons. Have we checked with them that this doesn't affect them negatively, or that they have a plan to deal with it? What about the regular tankers that are coming to our island? The LPG tankers, the ones delivering fuel here? What about those cement transport ships down at the cement plant in the north? My question is, have we checked with the operators that they can comply with these regulations? Have they agreed that the implementation of this legislation will not effectively prevent them from doing business with us? Has the analysis been done as to how much the shipping costs will increase to Barbados under the requirements of this legislation? Go back to the point I made. At some point, you have to decide that you've got to repair that faucet because it is leaking. The question is, where is the money coming from? So if we agree that we have to do this, my question is, who is paying for it? Let's get back to the core of the matter. The obligations, like, for example, I think it is Article 15 where it starts in the legislation, and I have taken the time to read it. This is a long one, but I did take some time to read everything on it. The Article 15 speaks to obligations, or general obligations, and then later on there are many, many articles with specific obligations are created. Those obligations, as I see it, really, sir, are threefold. There are obligations that are a cost to comply. There are obligations where there's a cost to monitor and enforce it. And there are obligations in this legislation throughout it where there's a cost to Barbados to provide facilities for the discharge of the various pollutants in our port. For example, Article 15, the obligation, and I will quote from it, 15.3 says, ozone depleting substances carried on board vessels or platforms shall be discharged in appropriate reception facilities in accordance with Chapter 3 of MARPOL, Annex 6. I understand completely why we need to be on to that. My question is, who is funding the reception facility? Who is bearing that cost? How are we doing that if that doesn't exist today? How are we doing it? Articles 16 and 17, they lay out even more. And it is that cost that I am focused on, because at the end of the day, it has been my experience that it is the final consumer who is going to pay these costs. It's the 260,000 souls in Barbados who are going to have to pay the cost of the obligations that we are signing up to, rightfully so, but this is a problem not of our making. What is the cost in Article 70? What is the cost of meeting the duties at the port? Article 73 and 74. 74, sir, especially gives obligations that after 6 months of when we pass this act, if it's passed today, as it likely would be, we have to have an internal energy audit. Who's paying for that to be done? It looks like a whole lot of people to me also is being created. So there's technical managers, port engineer, energy manager, energy management team, climate change coordinator. They're all listed in there. Perhaps they already exist, but maybe they're new people. Maybe it's new skills that we're going to hire. Because when I read some of the responsibilities, my gosh, the responsibility of the technical manager alone, which is covered in number 77, climate change coordination in the maritime sector, rapid assessment of ship emissions, energy audits, consultations, energy sustainability strategies, and it goes on. And I see more and more costs. Article 103 references a port waste reception facility, wash water testing. Who is doing that? Are we building a lab, sir? Is there a plan to build a lab here that we can actually test this water? How are we doing that? And perhaps all of these things have been thought of. Articles 105 and 106, residue generated by EGCS. EGCS is exhaust gas cleaning systems. So you burn harmful fuels in your engine, you filter it through some water, you take out the harmful stuff so that you don't kill the birds, but now you have some contaminated water on board your vessel. And when you come into the Barbados port, you have to discharge that, and we have to receive it. So you can't just throw that water now, which is contaminated, back into the ocean, because we would have saved the birds and we would have killed the fish. And as the Honourable Senator, sir, said, these penalties are big for non-compliance with this, as it should be, because the consequences are big, $100,000 fines. But it still leaves me with a big unanswered question, is what are we going to do with all of this nasty discharge stuff when they bring it into our port? What's the plan? How much of it are we going to be storing, and for how long? So this is not a different question of what I've asked about the electric vehicles, of which I own and drive one now. But I asked this question when we brought about this legislation, and I still don't know that we have answered it. What do we do with the spent lithium-ion battery in that car? Because we're doing the right thing, maybe, in protecting the environment and not discharging the carbon emissions from the internal combustion engine. But we need to get rid of that battery at some point in time. And this matter is urgent for us in Barbados because we've had these cars 6, 7, 8 years. Their batteries have reached their end of their useful life. I don't want to go in my treks, as I do from time to time, walking through gullies in Barbados, which I enjoy doing, to find an electric vehicle battery just disposed there with lithium ion, because I do not know what that will bring for us. So how will it be disposed? And this is all in an island, sir, where we have been agonizing, arguing, and even litigating for years on garbage disposal. It is a problem for us because we are so small, which we talked about before. We are only 166 square miles, 260,000 people competing for those spaces. Nobody wants a garbage dump next to them. Nobody wants an electricity plant next to them. Nobody wants a windmill next to them. It's a small place. we compete for these things. So, sir, I'm coming close to the end of what is an unusually long presentation for me. I know we want to be good global citizens, and I do as well, but we have limited resources, and we can't do everything. The amount of pollution that we generate is minuscule in comparison to our wealthy brothers and sisters in the industrial world. We need to choose carefully what we can do with the resources that we have. Not every mechanism is practical for us to implement, and we shouldn't have to bear the price for all of these mechanisms on our own. A good example, though, sir, where we have done very well is photovoltaic. The PV adoption in Barbados is significant, is really well, and all the government departments, all the government politicians, whoever wants to take credit for it should take credit for what they've done there. It makes sense for us in Barbados. Unfortunately, though, the lack of battery storage has now hamstringed us, or whatever the right word is. It's brought it to a halt. And I continue to be concerned that the failures in the process between FDC, Barbados Light and Power, interveners, some here, some not, it's harming all Barbadians. Our efforts in photovoltaic make really good sense for us as a country. It does reduce the carbon footprint, and for us in Barbados, it has a double impact. It reduces the cost of our imported fossil fuels into Barbados. So I do hope that we get past that impasse. I know a lot of work is being done on it, and I'm looking forward to the great news soon that all of the PV projects that have been announced and invested in are able to be brought online to the system. So, sir, I would just beg your indulgence. I want to stray into one area today which I normally do not go off topic, but I'm going to try to relate this to having good information and making good decisions based upon accurate information. And as I said earlier, we have accurate information, in my opinion, that climate change is of our own doing. But I'm very concerned in Barbados, sir, that we are allowing inaccurate information to be disseminated. And I want to give a specific reference to something that I heard on one of these call-in shows just after Kaduma. And this is the first time we've met since then. I heard the moderator say, "Let me read some submissions from the WhatsAppers." Now, I don't know, sir, if by saying that, you can then read whatever someone sends you. Because I thought that a radio station would have a responsibility to disseminate only accurate, reasonable information. And so, what did I hear next? I heard a wild accusation that the developer at the Pierhead, not far from here, had, in fact, destroyed the screw dock. Others have heard it, sir, not only you and I, others heard it. And sir, it happened to be very interesting to me because for the first time in about 30 years, the day before on Kaduma Day, I was invited out on a small speedboat and I took a tour into the Careenage, which I had not done in 30 years. Come in the Careenage that way. We were looking at the damage from the storm and so on. And I saw with my own two eyes the screw dock. And I saw the screw dock was surrounded by hoarding, so as to protect it from what was going on around me. But on the other hand, I am hearing on the call-in show, the moderator use the words, let me read from a note from a WhatsApper, and makes the allegation against the developer that they've destroyed the screw dock. Sir, that we cannot allow. They are under a license, a broadcast license in Barbados. They have a responsibility not to disseminate it. Are we going to have, what do they call it in the US? They call them alternative facts. As far as I know, the only alternative fact my grandmother knew about was a lie. I can't say the first word. So, sir, I apologize to digress for a moment, but I wanted to make sure we understood the connection between making decisions on good information that we have. And I think that we need to look at that very carefully because those shows seem to become in a place where you can just say well, I got this from somebody else. But what if I said today, well, you know, the leader of government business stole my lunch today and she is the thief? Am I allowed to say that, sir? If I said that in as a WhatsApp, can you just read that? That's not reasonable, sir. We need to address things like that in our little Barbados. So, sir, let's get back to this particular piece of legislation. And all I'm asking, and I will wrap up now, sir, is that we consider the implications, the cost implications of enacting these measures. Has it really been studied? Is there a cost and benefit analysis that can justify as a country where we represent less than 3/100,000th of the world population? Can we afford the measures that the obligations under here? And if we can't afford it as a country, I know we need to afford it as a world population. Who else is going to help us to pay to meet these obligations? Because we cannot put these obligations on our people when in fact those shipping companies are making huge gains in other places. The goods that they're shipping to Barbados from industrialized nations, they have made significant profits. The cost of the implementation of this cannot lie solely with us. And perhaps the government of Barbados has a plan as to how that can be offset. But frankly speaking, sir, I just need to understand the answers to these questions. Tell us what all the shipping companies have agreed to this. Tell us what this will really cost. Tell us who will pay the bill. Tell us how we are getting others to help us to foot this bill. So, sir, with those comments, I support what the bill goals are. It has obviously been prepared by technical people much more knowledgeable than me on these subjects. But as I have often said, and I bring the perspective of what does this mean when I go to the cash register at the supermarket, does this mean that I have to pay more because we signed up for this? And sir, with those few comments on this bill, I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Malaloux. Any other speakers? Senator Dr. Moronate.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I want to acknowledge the very good advocacy for climate change by Senator Malaloux. I think he very much contextualized the impact for Barbados, the impact of climate change generally, and particularly his continued call of who pays really brings to the fore the tension that many of us, when I say many of us, many countries like ours have to face in this whole issue, dialogue, challenge of the climate crisis. Who pays? Senator Malaloux talked about how we were, I can't remember the exact numbers, this is, I'm going to call it, proportion of the global population, small. But even when you look at our contribution to the GHG emissions, which is one of the biggest issues in relation to climate change, I actually went online, so this is again not information that I've gotten from any source that anybody else doesn't have privilege to, quoted, Mr. President, from an agency called Macro Trends, and this agency monitors GHG emissions from countries across the world. And it says that Barbados' greenhouse gas emissions for 2001 was 0.00%. Now, if it go down into the zeros, you will get some numbers, but it stopped there. And it indicated that that was down from 2020. We had a 1.46 decline, and then down again from 2019, where we had a 2.26 decline. So we contribute that, again, very small percentage of greenhouse gas emissions. But yet the impact, as indicated by Senator Malaloux, is disproportionate because it's real big. And so the choice for us in terms of how do we address that impact, and the choices that we have to make in terms of how we address and what we address with the little resources that we have is one of the biggest challenges, again, facing us as small island developing states in this climate crisis. And it is one, Mr. President, that is both local and global. And the answer of who pays, therefore, has to be both local and global as well. And this is one of the reasons why, again, Barbados' leadership of the Bridgetown Initiative has been so touted. Because we hear the discussion on the Bridgetown Initiative and we see the leadership of the Prime Minister, but then we don't often connect it, that it is intended to really answer and call to account those that contribute the most to the issue, and call to account the disparities in terms of who has to pay for addressing the impacts. And that is really the impetus for the Bridgetown Initiative, and its call for the reform of the international financial architecture is about exactly that. Who pays? How do we pay? And it is really calling for, Mr. President, for multilateral development banks to make finance, again, more affordable for developing countries. It's calling for new mechanisms of finance. It is calling as well for the mobilization of resources from the large private sector globally in order to be able to support developing countries to be able to respond. And that is also as well the context for initiatives like these in relation to, one, addressing it, but also as well that critical question of who will pay, Mr. President. Again, Senator Malalu talked about the immense profits. The statistics suggest that the global shipping industry for the first quarter only of 2024 recorded profits of some 5.4 million. And it is suggested that by 2050, the shipping industry...
Sorry, just for clarity.
Sorry.
Which, I didn't hear, which, you said million, billion, what was it?
Oh, sorry.
Trillion?
No, I said million, but it's really billion. It's billion.